Hello, good afternoon, everyone. We're going to get started just as the rest of the house begins to fill. My name's Carrie Ryan. I'm the lead curator for learning, and I'm delighted to have you all here today. I'm just going to do a quick housekeeping rundown. The talk is being conducted in English, so do make sure if you want simultaneous interpretation that you have a headset. And there will be a Q&A at the end, and we'll be using this QR code for you to register your questions. So if you have any questions during the talk, please make sure to scan the QR code and you can enter them in there, and the team will help send those to the speakers. So I'm going to turn you over to Dorian Chong, our Deputy Director and Chief Curator, who will introduce our panel today. Thank you.
Thank you, Carrie. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to welcome you to the opening day talk for the exhibition I Am Pei, Life is Architecture. This event celebrates the public opening of this landmark exhibition, the first full-scale retrospective of one of the greatest architects of our time. This exhibition has been 7 years in the making. It is also very special for us because it's the first architecture-focused exhibition since the M+ opened in 2021. We would like to thank Pei's family and many of his colleagues and associates for all the support and trust that they have given us over the years to make this project possible. For today's talk, we're very happy to have with us 3 architects with intimate knowledge of I Am Pei. They are Sandy Pei, Calvin Tsao, and Aslihan Demirtas, who will share their experience of working with I Am Pei and also reflect on how Pei exercised his values on architecture, cities, and life throughout his work. The conversation will be moderated by the exhibition co-curator, Shirley Surya. Before I invite the speakers onto the stage, I would also like to take this opportunity to thank our lead sponsor, Bank of China, Hong Kong, for their generous support for this project. Thank you so much. Enjoy the talk.
Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Carrie and Dorian, for the introduction. We're gonna go right in, and before we start, I just wanted to mention why this conversation has to take place to open also the exhibition. I just wanted to, okay, let me see. I have to be in charge of the clicker. Hold on. Okay. So yes, so it opens today. And again, thank you for all the support and coverage for this show and response so far. We are highly encouraged by this. And I think I just wanted to mention, again, the exhibition itself was, again, these are just the rooms or the themes that we are very kind of clear about that needs to be addressed because they are very much characterizing Pei's very unique life and practice. So whether it's about his beginnings of cross-cultural foundations in school, but also where he lived in Hong Kong, Shanghai, and Suzhou, to what actually happened in his earliest part of the career, which people don't really realize, which is a real estate development, but a design team within it, to his really affecting the cities and how the cities figure in his tower design, to his design of the museums, but museums not just for kind of putting up works, but also for people to be inhabiting it, to be finding it an attractive space to be. And also the fourth one is really key. It's really more about storytelling that the agents of producing architecture is really more than just the architects, but the power behind the buildings and the cities, so states, clients, and that process in which Pei has to contend with is something that we find very valuable to understand and to even remember, not to take for granted these projects that actually manifested. And then the fifth one is something that is quite predictable, but do look out for how we wanted to focus on his concrete stage, as well as before it moves towards glass and steel. And then the sixth chapter really is looking at more than just how he used history, not just a simple mishmash of old and new or east or west, but something more considered, something more about bringing old and new into a productive tension. So this talk today is similar in terms of the exhibition. I just wanted to mention 3 points that so far the last week has been a lot of conversations with media, people asking questions about how you chose to frame the exhibition. And I just wanted to bring up 3 points that kind of are emphasized in the exhibition, but also what we hope to kind of bring out today, which is the first one is architecture as live. So again, live as architecture and architecture as live is actually part of this symbiotic kind of relationship. It's neither this nor that, but both are very important. And we wanted to focus on that because architecture is also more than just the building. It's about the values, it's about the people, the relationship between the building and the city, and also it's values that are beneath or beyond a hype or trend or about a kind of ism or style, but about convictions, about people, about publicness, right? And so I think today, just being able to have Calvin, Aslihan, and Sandy in this conversation, we hope to be able to bring out that sort of multifaceted views and responsibilities of the architect that is not just purely as the style maker, right? I think it's often about that sort of superficial way of looking at really form making in that sense. So the second point is about architecture as collaborative practice, as collaborative authorship. And I think this is something that I just wanted to emphasize. It's a tension between the lead designer, the lead architect, the leader, like Mr. Pei, but also the fact that he's working within the context of a team, right? With tremendous skill sets, very unique for each project. And today, I think we find it very again, privileged to have each of you to be in this conversation because each of you have contributed to very particular projects that may have also other players in it, but at the same time, we have invited you because you have very unique insight to the process in designing particular projects. And so we wanted to emphasize that. So I think when you look at the exhibition, you notice that there are drawings and sketches that are not by Mr. Pei. But does that mean less? And I think for us as a team, and as a historian, it's not. This is how a lead architect really wheeled several people, talents, to really put together a project that could really into completion and to a successful one. And the third one is about architecture across contexts, cultures, and territories in a way that actually acknowledges difference, but at the same time embracing it, and always seeking to draw from the regional while shaping the global. So in each of these varied contexts, whether it's about late 1970s Beijing, early 80s Beijing, to Doha in the early 2000s when the Qatar museums was just started, to even designing of the chapel in Miho in mid-2000, or even, I guess for Sandy, it'll be everything from the late 50s onwards, all the way throughout your life in really witnessing Pei's, life, literally life and career. And so all these contexts, we really wanted to be able to bring out this ability or capacity or openness, I guess, to all these differences, but at the same time wanting to be a part of it and understand it. So yeah, so with that, we're going to start with Calvin. Let's see. So Calvin, I'm so sorry. I need to introduce all of you because they are all. I mean, you can read it in the website, but I think I just need to mention it again. So Calvin, thank you for coming all the way from New York. Calvin is the architect principal of Tao and McCone, based in New York. And before founding Tao and McCone in 1985, he was joined IMP and Partners in early 1980s as one of the architects working on Fragrant Hill Hotel, as well as the Bank of China Tower, some aspects of it in the 80s. And Aslihan Demirtas is the founder of Cora, an expanded architectural practice that really is based on research, art, and ecology. It was first established in New York and then now is based in Istanbul. So just a little bit about Aslihan, which I don't need to go and ask later. It was after she completed her graduate degree program at MIT, and it's the Aga Khan program for Islamic architecture that she collaborated with Mr. Pei as the lead project designer for the Museum of Islamic Art in Doha, Qatar, as well as later, surprisingly, for the Miho Institute of Aesthetics Chapel in Japan. And lastly, but not least important, thank you, Sandy, again, for being here the whole week and letting us bombard you with so many media requests and interviews. Is the co-founder of Pei Architects, formerly Pei Partnership Architects, and the third son of Eileen Pei and Yoming Pei. So after Harvard Graduate School of Design, he entered IMP and Partners in 1976. So you've witnessed it all. And Sandy had worked with Mr. Pei, his father, in completing projects including the Wiesner Building, which at MIT, the Creative Artists Agency headquarters in Los Angeles, and the Bank of China Tower in Hong Kong, of course. So with that, we'll start with Sandy to question you. So wait, clicker first.
Okay. Hello.
Yes. So Calvin, we are returning to the beginning of the reform era in China. It's 1979.
First of all, thank you for it's been a real privilege, of course, to be included in this august event. with some of our esteemed colleagues that span the whole decades of I am Pei's work. And it's interesting because it's actually one of your former colleague, Eric Chan, approached me because he was a good friend of mine. Says, M+ would very much like to hold an exhibition, and since I've worked with Pei, would I make an introduction? And I said, well, actually, what you really need to do is I'll introduce you to Sandy. So Sandy basically pulled out all the stops and convinced his father. The interesting thing that at first he said, well, his work was not done, so and he said to me actually, he said, well, if you wanted to know my work, go see the work. And I said, well, not everyone's privileged to go to all over the world to see your work. So actually having an exhibition, comprehensive exhibition of you and your work, but also perhaps the man behind the work would be really important because you've been so reticent and focused on your work. Anyway, so I'm so glad that we're now, Sandy, you and I are bookending this talk with Islihan in the middle to represent different eras of I.M.'s work. So I'm going to, you corrected me earlier, and I said, well, in a way, Fragrant Hill was the beginning of his approach to looking at integrating Chinese vernacular. And of course, it's not true because his earlier work, starting from his thesis at MIT, was a museum at Harvard, sorry, a museum in China. But at the same time, I think why I say that is that finally, I think he felt that the moment is right to actually create something looking at how to integrate his life's work and his developing his language, his approach, his attitude, and to integrate the vernacular language that he holds so close to his heart. So here's a picture of a recent picture of Fragrant Hill. I'm very surprised the trees have grown so lusciously large. Garden actually is just as important to I.M. as the building itself. So.
Yes, we're going to talk more about the garden because
Yes.
there's going to be a lot of garden photographs.
So-
But before that, Calvin, I'm going to ask you, I'm going to remind, I guess, also the audience here how the project came about, which is basically, as you will see in the exhibition, that this is pretty much, please invite Mr. Pei to design a skyscraper hotel next to Forbidden, okay, not next to, but around Forbidden City. And of course, he would naturally rejected it and even influenced the city to come up with a kind of height limit, basically do not build within a certain radius from the Forbidden City of a certain height. And it is also a very important one because one of the earliest projects that actually is collaboration between the municipality in Beijing and overseas companies. And of course, a Hong Kong company called YTT was very much behind this and financed it. So I just wanted to share this is when Calvin entered.
Right, that's when I entered,
Yes.
fresh out of school, actually, and very green. So I think it's really interesting how you mentioned about teamwork. I think the fact that I.M. is able to see with among his office who's the right person to work on what part. I think Islihan, you both can be very sympathetic about that. And I don't know what he saw in me, but somehow, less than a year after I graduated, and I've only had one other job at Richard Myers, and got fired actually, and I did. You see, sometimes adversity is opportunity, and one of the partners at Richard Myers said, "Oh, you poor thing, maybe you could get a job. I hear that my friend at I.M. Pei, Kellogg Wang, is looking for someone who speaks Chinese." And I said, "Oh, I speak Chinese." Little did I not disclose that I knew Cantonese, not Mandarin. So anyway, that's how I started. I snuck in, and I was put on this job after 6 months of counting bathroom tiles, actually, for the New York Convention Center. But to make a long story short, I started, of course, drawing. Drawing is seeing, and talking about I am choosing this site. He was given I don't know how many number of proposals, and to everyone's surprise, he chose this seemingly very modest low-rise hotel, and it was a proposal by the First Service Bureau, which controls the hospitality arm of the Beijing Chinese government. We always suspected that they actually just want to snuck this in at their clubhouse, because during the whole design process, first they kind of rejected any suggestion that we should have an international management, hotel management, to manage it afterwards. But at the same time, they realized that they needed a program of hospitality requirements. So IM did recommended that the Hyatt Group, along as YTT, to consult, and I was charged with actually coordinating the interiors. But eventually, what I think he saw in me was somehow this very important thing, I think, for him, which is the integration between nature and architecture. And as you can see, this site is a very sensitive negotiation between its existing vegetation, trees, and so on. We spend endless months looking at how to actually integrate architecture around existing trees. At the same time, creating formal and spatial balance. And of course, we all were very involved in understanding Chinese gardens and Chinese courtyards. And so their internal courtyard, the Great Hall, as well as the relationship of it to all the smaller meandering courtyards around. The big move, of course, is the forecourt and the back garden. The forecourt is of course an auto court, and it has a very different relationship between landscape, which is a series of groves of trees that wraps around the circulation of the vehicular path. But the back garden was where that IM was paying most attention of how to use a southern idiom of Suzhou gardens in the context of a northern climate. And that's when he brought in Professor Chen Zhou to help us. Yeah. Speaking of teamwork, and I still don't know how that happened, but Mr. Pei said, Calvin, just make an attempt to draw something in the backyard before Professor Chen comes so that he has something to critique. Pressure.
You did it. So before that,
just like what you did, it's like, yeah. Islamic architecture, let's do it. So I studied, immediately a crash course on Suzhou Garden. I mean, born in Hong Kong. What do I know about Chinese gardens back then? Victoria Park, that's all I knew. Of course, water was a very important film. But we noticed that there was a ruin in the middle of the back garden. It's a thing that we'll talk about later, which is called the Liu Sui Ying. It's a Chinese scholarly garden element where poets would take a glass of wine and float it along this fake stream, and they're supposed to compose a poem. At the end of the stream, when the cup approached the end of the stream, if you're supposed to finish your poem. And then I don't remember whether if you win, then you drink, or if you lose, you drink. Maybe they just drank.
We love Calvin's all these wonderful anecdotes, but we are hoping to.
Sorry.
So allow me to zoom in on this, because this is your masterpiece as well.
Yeah.
I guess, but I think I wanted to know what is the intention in having to, I guess, superimpose your building or design against this.
So Mr. Pei said, let's do something. So we look at the plan, we look at the water, and then how to present the context. And of course, the Fragrant Hill Mountains were there, and at the time, without 3D capabilities, we looked at Chinese paintings, and which actually made a collage of it and situated into this rendering as a kind of poetic suggestion.
Why did you have to do this? Is it something about convincing the clients?
Oh gosh, I don't know. I just did it. I guess I have nothing else to do on a Saturday afternoon.
All good, all good. So I think this is part of the portfolio that you will
Yeah,
see
well done.
in the
Anyway,
exhibit. It's meant for the office.
I said,
Yep.
yes, let's show this. So we showed it.
All good.
But here's the more technical thing, which is that look at the topography and the trees and how we actually create the intersection between the courtyard, the trees, existing trees, and also the topography, kind of cascading down
Yeah.
to the ground.
Can you share with us about your kind of very renewed use of the tiles that was meant for roof, but you're using it in this way on the photo?
So Suzhou landscape is a gray and white idiom, and it's of course at the same time it's very graphic. And so the elevations of the windows, there's so many windows for hotels that how to create a rhythm of these windows and link them together in a plaster construction. And so using a graphic tile inlay was the way to try and create a pictorial representation of this facade, which is something actually quite new because in Western architecture, there's most of the time it's a very pictorial way, right? It's a painterly way of doing facade, which I think is very novel and new.
Thank you.
And so, of course, it's so new that even the Chinese don't understand. And here, these are our clients. And I remember actually Fred took this picture, and we were just looking, and these people were just befuddled. And afterwards, I said, well, this is it. And they were like, 很好,很好,很好. Were you there? I think. Anyway, and then they were like, they said 很好,很好, but their face told something else. So anyway.
All good. Yes, this is the tension.
Yeah.
But
they let us
do it.
do it.
Yes.
So that was
I know.
amazing.
So there goes the hard work begin.
So here goes the hard work. We we had to gather all the workers who were paying 40 yuan a year or something outrageous like that, or maybe it's a month. But anyway, it's still very little money, and they're not motivated. And so it's really important, like talking about work experience, is trying to motivate the workers beyond the job, and you gotta be a best friend. And eventually, I moved into the dorm with them and hung out and got it done. It's a real lesson for me.
Wow.
And I said, actually, once upon a time, once I.M. came to visit, and he was looking for me, and he goes, "Where's Calvin? Where am I?" So that's me in the middle, then the far left, and that was that day. He said, "Where's Calvin?" I was standing right next to him, and he goes, "Where's Calvin?" And as you can see, I'm kind of like most Hong Kong people, very interested in, sartorial presentation. I like
Sartorial.
to wear nice clothes, and he always seen me wearing pretty contemporary clothes, and I was like masquerading as a local Chinese, and she didn't recognize me at all.
Okay, so this is you about that.
And so that was really a funny thing. That we were so nervous when he came, because there's just a disaster area, as you can see, the middle picture. And I'm like, I am looking over there. What do you think about that? And he's like, no, look over here. And it was really quite a memory of those moments.
Well, everything still got built.
And as you can see,
Regardless,
Herculean. We did it in record time, and this is how we move things around with logs and wheels. And we went to the stone forest and negotiated with the local chieftains to get the stones that had fallen from the and to do it. And here.
And you used it for both the outdoors and inside.
Right. I actually saw it in a airline magazine that there was these Shiling, and
In
he said,
Yunnan
Yunnan forest. And he said, well, because the Suzhou rocks, which is way too small for this scale, so what to do? So that was
So what is this idea behind bringing the kind of the garden or the pond into the building?
so the inside out nature architecture was always in his mind, and you can see the windows then translate into screens inside instead of glass. There's a corridor, internal corridor wrapping around the Great Hall, and as you can see also the Meihua shaped windows. Which was quite controversial because it's just so pictorial. It's not modern, as someone said.
Yeah, we'll share a
you
bit
know,
of those images
modern.
later on.
Yeah.
But you mentioned about the
Right. So
water
this is a
maze
picture of
just
the
now.
Liu Suiying.
Yeah.
So that was so destroyed that they said it's easier if we just made a new one, and so actually they just carved it right in place out of solid stone. And this is a funny picture because it really looks like, did he really rest that piece of stone on his knees?
The state of
It was just
manual
a joke.
labor.
And
Okay.
so finally, here's the Liu Suiying, and it's a pride of place in the back garden, surrounded by this lake, and of course the idea of reflection, light and dark shadows, reflection and solidity and ephemerality are those kind of dialectics that Mr. Pei really was very interested in.
Something about that tree.
Yeah.
So this was
talk
taken
about-
2021.
I don't know what happened to that tree. It seemed to be arrested development, which is exactly what he had in mind, which is the tree that would cast a shadow on this simple elevation. And we looked at, I would say we went to a tree farm, at least 60 some odd trees.
Wow, this is actually, if you've been at Zuozhengyuan, I have this exact
Yeah.
elevation in Zuozhengyuan in Suzhou, so it's quite.
So it's a kind of memory
Yeah.
thing.
So this is the one that you mentioned about the plum blossom.
Exactly. But you can see that there's all these play of like transparency. I think these idea of memory and what you've seen before and returns back. If you look at Suzhou Gardens and Qingyuan, it's always been this kind of getting lost and then find yourself again, and motifs recurring.
Yeah. And just to share, we didn't have this photo in the exhibition, but that's Zhao Wuqi's painting. I think
Yes,
from the
yes,
corner
that's a
on the
beautiful
right.
painting.
Yeah. So it's in the inner room.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is really talking about a real collaboration of all these different amazing. And speaking of which, this was total design because Mr. Pei wanted everything so right, and we were getting very limited consultancies from Hyatt because the client wasn't interested in compensating them. So we had very limited. My colleague Tracy Turner, who's a graphic designer for the firm, and I literally spend months doing everything down to the ashtray. One thing that was really beautiful is this lampshade, which is made out of cloisonne and with a crackled ice, which is a theme throughout this project.
Yes, and of course, this one you will see also, and thankfully, the only object we have of Pei's team's
I
work,
know.
which is in the
and I
M+
keep-
collections.
Exactly.
Yeah. And you mentioned about this is an example where Pei wanted to make everything in Beijing.
Everything, including a huge 9-meter square carpet in one piece.
There.
Right there. And he wanted this crackle ice and meihua, again, the idea of the meihua shape in the Chinese painting. So it's like, brushwork. And to interpret that into a carpet, how many knots per square inch was really a hard thing to do. And I would say that this is one of my learning moments because I was sweating bullets trying to get this right for Mr. Pei. And finally, I have to go to the factory and discover, find a way to work with the workers.
Yeah. Oh, I wish we can really go into another project, but I think we'll just probably have to end at
Yes.
your reflection of Fragrant Hill Hotel. This is the image of the opening, but also an advertisement about what is the impact of this project on Pei or even on China. So
Right.
it would be good to hear your thoughts on that question.
Well, I think that right after it was done, people were befuddled and they're thinking, well, is this I.M. Pei's postmodern moment, which is totally not right. But it was in the height of the postmodern period. But I think his intention was not that at all. It's really about going back to see how to integrate the Western architectural idiom so far into a Chinese vernacular, but not just formal, but spiritual in the sense of, like the spirit screen. It's not an architectural thing. It's alone. It's a way of navigating of you see, you don't see. It's about procession, things that are not about just the form.
Yeah,
I
which
think
is spatial and ceremonial.
exactly.
Those levels. Yeah.
Exactly, and also like the garden where the building kind of pays homage to nature.
Oh, thank you, Calvin. I wish we could hear more storytelling, but
Sorry, I
yeah,
need to going on and
no,
on.
all good, all good. So I think we're
So-
gonna move to Aslahan right now. But wait, hold on. Before that, at least end with 1 second. Your favorite image, which is this.
What?
Where's the cuff? How come? it's
Okay,
not moving?
so
here.
Okay,
1
so
second. Here.
all right.
So you want to add this?
So I added this the last minute because I was actually sneaking out to get my shirts done in Ascot Chan, and the salesman said, "Oh, Mr. Page have his shirts made here," and he pulled out the Qingdan, the list of all the shirts that I.M. has ordered over the years, and he said, "Oh, Mr. Page designed this cuff." So I'm just so impressed that for I.M. there's no details too large or too small.
Thank you. Thank you. So yes, thank you, Calvin. We shall move. Yeah. Okay, we're gonna speed through two decades now, pretty much, from 1982 to 2000. Is that 2 decades? Yes, it is. And a completely different geography, and it's the Museum of Islamic Art Doha. It is the very much the first project by the Qatar Museums Authority as part of their ambition to build a cultural capital, I guess in that sense, and Aslahan is very much part of it. So I'm going to ask her about how you got introduced into the project. Yeah.
Sure. Before I start, I just want to say a sentiment I've had ever since I arrived here to this exhibition, that I miss Mr. Pei's smiling self here, surrounded with all his works. And I did meet him with his smiling self through an interview. I actually had just graduated from the Aga Khan program of Islamic architecture from MIT, a school which Mr. Pei also attended, and had applied for a job through Kellogg Wong. And I got jet called back immediately for a secret project. I have to say that I interviewed and accepted a job with Mr. Pei for a secret project. I didn't know yet because the contract wasn't signed yet, so they were not free to talk about it. But very soon it was evident that it was for the Museum of Islamic Arts in Doha, Qatar. And having graduated from the Aga Khan program at MIT, Mr. Pei was asking me and looking at me for knowledge of what would be Islamic architecture. And there's one detail that I need to say, because at the Aga Khan program of Islamic architecture, even though the program is called Islamic architecture, the first thing you learn is that there's no Islamic architecture, just like there's no Christian architecture or there's no Jewish architecture, because architecture, there's architecture in Iran, in Doha, or in different geographies, but it is a category that has been imposed by a certain part of the world onto another part of the world. It's a Western historical category to put up everything together and call it Islamic architecture. So having just gotten out of this kind of indoctrination, I see Mr. Pei in front of me every single meeting. What is Islamic architecture, Aslihan? And soon, I had to learn that he has a way of asking a question over and over again, or requesting something over and over again. For me, I come more from a Mediterranean and Middle Eastern culture, and usually we're like when we ask a question and you answer a question, then you're, okay, didn't we talk that before? Didn't we close that conversation? No, he kept on asking me, what is the essence of Islamic architecture? Every single time I answered him, either that there's no category like Islamic architecture, or that there's no essence of Islamic architecture. But confronted with the same question over and over again, I started to understand that this actually is a device. The question is not the question itself to understand the essence of Islamic architecture, but it is a device to find design direction, to understand and to discuss, questioning the assumptions of the building. And so every single time I found myself that I was answering a different answer, which actually turned this all into a discussion about what would be a building that is situated in Doha, Qatar, which has a different culture of habitation, and that would house Islamic art. So the building as a container had to house all different kinds of eras and ages of Islamic art. So it had to be in a certain way neutral to a certain kind of a empire or politics or age, and also encompass and embrace the arts, and also put Doha, Qatar in the map via this building, where it was also positioning itself as the owner of a wonderful, rich collection. So he understood this responsibility very, very deeply, that this was a building that had a very large scale of let's say, custodianship, and also reflection of identity. So to answer these questions, we, in the end, as you can see over the slides, we actually went over and over a lot of different kinds of examples. The one in the slide in the before that you saw, this, yes, exactly. And the conversation actually was a visual conversation. We looked at different examples and looked at how the material was used and how the spatial characteristics were organized. And Mr. Pei was really infatuated by this Sabil, which is a fountain found in the middle of Ibn Tulun Mosque in Cairo. This is the 13th century building. And the building inside is actually is a Sabil that houses water. So he actually, in the end, he took his cue from this example that, for him, summarized in a very essential way, in his own words, the play of light, which basically means that that's the geography and the materials. Again, it is it also the geography and the context that actually uses these materials. And you can see the faceting and the fact that as a standalone volume in the midst of a very flat field of stone that actually plays with, that becomes very, very dynamic throughout the day, throughout the seasons. So it's a very massive structure, but it changes every single day according to the sun and the seasons.
What about the geometry, Aslan?
The geometry, this is actually, Calvin was asking, I didn't know what he saw in me, but he had a way of seeing through people, through their talents. this is going to be also tying to the next project that I worked in, but this geometry is a way in which we actually gauge this world, in which we gauge nature. We understand the world through abstraction, through this geometry, but we also understand the world through material. These are very two specific ways in which we actually inhabit the world. And the geometry here is actually, it's pretty fantastic. And you can see this kind of Mukarnas geometry throughout what you would call in the complicated categorization of Islamic architecture, which is this genius way of transitioning from a square plan or a square volume to a dome, to a sphere. And you can actually see that you transition from a square, and then you transition to an octagon, and then you transition onto a circle. And by way of that, and by way of that faceting, you can, this transitions onto a closed space, but then also it actually creates a very dynamic, faceted structure.
So yeah, this is an early drawing of that proposal, I guess, from that extraction of that deformal device. Yes, and I'll just share more about just the siting.
Yes.
To say about how he chose to cite this.
Yes. So, of course, Mr. Pei he was shown many different kinds of sites, and all of which he refused to build on. And then he went to the water side and he said, I want to build here, and he showed the sea, basically. So he chose a site where the building, often it is interpreted as he wanted to build somewhere where his building would not be surrounded by other buildings. But I actually that is true, I think. That's one reason. But the deeper reason about this decision is the fact that he, the way he wanted to, the example he took, the Ibn Tulun Mosque, Sebil, how it stands in a field of flatness. So that was one of the reasons that he wanted to build on top of the sea, because it gave him this flat field, this flat surface on which his building would stand. So basically the building also built its own corniche, built its own bay, because here you can also see there's a almost semicircular bay that is artificially built, and then there's an island at the end of this corniche. In a way, talking about landscape, Mr. Pei here he actually shaped the landscape, or the nature and the topography and the site within which the Museum of Islamic Arts would be situated. So this is also due to the fact that it's actually easy to do infill structures in the Gulf area. And here you can see a shot from the construction site where...
Sorry, I wish I want you to talk about the detail of the design, which you're really involved in.
Okay.
There's so much of each project, so rich, but allow us to speed.
Yes.
But yes, this is really your hand
Yes.
In designing the dome.
Yes, the dome, this has an interesting story as well, because, when I started to work with Mr. Pei, there's always, in the office, there's always a culture of how you have to work with Mr. Pei. He usually asks you to work on something, and you quickly learn that you want to do alternatives, because like first time you go, and then you show him one drawing, and he will look around like, where's the other 15? And so he wants to see alternatives, because the way he works, just like he asked the question, what is Islamic architecture, over and over again, he actually asked those questions to himself. He's always very, very questioning with his own decisions, if it is the best solution to a problem, because in architecture, we don't have a single problem. We have a single solution. We have millions of solutions for a single question. So he was very disciplined about questioning himself all the time. He was never comfortable in his in a solution. So therefore, he always looked around for 15 other alternatives. So quickly, I learned that I would do a lot of iterations and alternatives, which I was incredibly happy to do because, I love the design. So with the dome, though, I actually was working on a scheme that he had asked me, and then I thought, the geometric genius that I.M. Pei is, I don't think he would just design a semicircular dome and have a pattern on it. So I actually looked at this Mukarnas tradition that I had, that I just mentioned, and I made on my own a model of this dome that looked slightly more elongated than that. And then I actually did show it to the team, and the team told me, "Did Mr. Pei ask you to do this?" And then I said, "No, but I thought this would be very interesting." Everybody was horrified. And I was like, how can we do this now? How do we present this to him? And dear Perry Chin, who was our project manager, and also dear Tosan Lim, who was also, if he's here, we were the core trio who worked with Mr. Pei back then. So Mr. Perry Chin had decided that I sit at the very, very far edge of the table with the dome model next to me. And if Mr. Pei would look at it and say like, "Oh, what is that?" I would approach and I would show him the dome so as not to impose to him a certain kind of design, which quickly turned to like, "What is that?" And then we started to work on the dome. So the dome is it's two spheres nested onto each other, and the two spheres are actually divided equally, and those very abstract points are connected to each other. So actually the dome looks very maybe complicated in its geometry, but its principles are incredibly pure and simple. So it's built in stainless steel, and the way you actually transition to this dome geometry is, again, through the 4 columns which support the petals that go to the rim, as you can see in the model, and then they actually have a much more faceted edge as a belt, if you will, and then you transition onto this dome, which actually, on the exterior, you can see how Mr. Pei wanted to play with the light, with the faceting of the building, and also internally, the light goes through the oculus of this dome, and it actually travels throughout the day.
Thank you. I'm going to bring you straight to Japan. So this is about a couple of years later, unpredictably, there's this statement that you shared. I guess you never expected me to make you work in Kyoto. So this is kind of near there. So just wanted to share, just wanted to get Asahan to share about how he cajoled you, I guess, or coerced you, or encouraged you to join this project.
Exactly. I mean, there was also something very interesting about Mr. Pei, I think, that I learned throughout the years. If he wanted to convince you, he would definitely convince you. So, I had begged Nancy and Shelley, secretaries, not to connect Mr. Pei to me if he wanted me to work for him again. And of course, I mean, Nancy is loyal to Mr. Pei, not me, and she connected me at a certain point where he asked me to meet first for lunch about the project, then to help him for 2 months until a meeting in Kyoto, and then 2 years later, I was able to get out of the MIHO project. So one lunch, 2 years later, and he actually told me this, how I was hired to work on Museum of Islamic Arts Doha is because I had a insight into the culture, and I knew about the history and the geography and basically the architecture. And for him, I was not connected to Japan at all. And he actually said, "Aslihan, I would never think you working on a Japanese project, but here you are. I need you to solve this geometry." So So I actually got into the Miho project through the context of geometry, which we were both very fond of, and I actually really loved working with him, with a master who could rotate a three-dimensional, very complex object in his head and be aware of the dimensions, be aware of the connections, be aware of every single geometrical relationships. This is an incredible aspect. This was an incredible aspect of him. So I learned a lot. And through this project, I learned a lot like Calvin did, because I actually had no idea what this was. And also Mr. Pei promised me that there would be an engineer who would help me, who actually had twins and moved to California. So I actually had to download a Mathematica reader and look at formulas and he said, like, this is a teardrop shape. Yes. The beauty of this project is it's actually it is born out of a gesture. It's not born out of a geometric calculation or mathematical formula. And I want to quote dear Eileen Pei here. The first time she saw the project, and Mr. Pei had a habit of, he always brought Mrs. Pei to view and maybe critique the projects whenever the project was worthy of seeing. And when she actually came to the office and she said, Aslihan, I'm so happy you joined, because he will not stop cutting pieces of paper in the house. The house is a mess. He will wake up in the middle of the night. He will turn the lights on, 3 in the morning, start cutting it and folding it and thinking and making notes, and then go back to bed. So, so this is where I actually, I was very happy. And of course, I was incredibly nervous. It was something I had never done before, and I didn't know how to construct this either. And just like Kevin was saying, he actually knew how to throw you onto a very turbulent sea and see if you can survive. And usually you do, you actually do. So this is, I want to share this. It can be very architecturally nerdy, but it's actually worth looking at this, because this was the moment which we were very confident about the geometry, because it wasn't, this whole geometry, this teardrop shape was not derived by a mathematical formula, mathematics being the poetry of abstraction, if you will, but it was derived with poetry of the physical geometry. So if you take a donut shape, and if you actually cut it at a tangent, and you get this very, very special teardrop shape, that can be derived through a geometrical gesture. Like the curve is not derived through a formula, but it is derived through a geometrical section. So it is actually very architecturally driven. So Shelley's telling me.
I know. I have to move to the next. So I'm just going to show you the study models that, yes, or I guess a result of that process.
So this is when this model was done for the meeting. Mr. Pei asked me to help him for 2 months, and then you go, which I couldn't. So we actually we finally came up with the shape, and we 3D modeled it and 3D printed it, and took it to Japan, and. This is from the second version of the model, where in the first version you actually see this envelope of metal, and this is a very beautiful building, because a gesture becomes this beautiful envelope that separates the exterior and the interior, and as we further articulate the project, the exterior remained to be metal, but also the interior was covered in wood, which, as you can, in the beginning image, you can see that it is actually situated inside the cedar forests of Shigaraki.
Thank you. I know there's so much more, but we have to move to our last but not least, Sandy. This is going to be a bit of a chronological kind of a survey. Yeah, so again, this is the most personal insight of Mr. Pei and the family, but also you witnessing him having worked pretty much since you were a child. So I'll just, let you start and prompt.
Yeah, no, I'm going to go back a little bit. I think my role after these wonderful descriptions of some of these these projects, I really want to talk a little bit about my experience growing up in this environment. As you can see on the photograph here, I think this was taken probably around 1964. So I was at that point about 15 years old, and we were traveling to Italy, as you can see. But I only have this photograph just as an introduction to the family life. This is my brother all the way on the right, and my other brother, eldest brother, next to me, who's 5 years older. And then next to my mother is my sister, who is 10 years younger than I am. This is taken in 1964, so you can have a sense of it. The reason I wanted to, can we go to the next image? I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the early days, first, of my father's professional career. When he left Harvard, where he had been teaching for a period of time, he was invited through a connection with Philip Johnson, who was at the time, I think, the associate director in architecture at the Museum of Modern Art, who knew my father because of Harvard. He was introduced to real estate developer William Zeckendorf, a mega developer, the most prominent developer in New York and in the United States at the time, who was looking to find an architect to run his department. This was a very unusual idea. And also very unusual was the whole notion that an architect of any repute would dare to work for a real estate developer. It was almost unethical for an architect to work for a real estate developer. But in fact, my father took this position because he felt that he could learn quite a bit from Zeckendorf at the time, this being 1948 or 49. He was planning to return to China. And so he wanted to learn as much as he could about how you look at property, how you look at land, how you evaluate the potentials of a building. And Zeckendorf being so prominent and having access, he said, oh, I'm going to do this for a little bit of time. So he took on this job. He thought it would be a short period of time, but then the Sino-Japanese War, World War II, intervened, and suddenly what became sort of a short stint ended up being a little bit longer. But later on, he used to say that this was a period he wished he didn't have, because during that time he couldn't do museums and he couldn't do monuments here and there. But my argument is, and I think the thesis even in the exhibition that you'll hear at the museum, is that this is a very fundamentally important period of his life. In my mind, probably taught him more lessons that he applied in his career later on than just about any other period. This is a period from about 1948 to, let's say, 1956, about that time. And Zeckendorf used to come, call him up. Zeckendorf used to live right above us in an apartment building that my father designed, his apartment. And Zeckendorf had a Cadillac with one of the only telephones in it. This is back in the 50s. And so he would call my father up at very early in the morning, say, "Yo, Ming, come down. We're gonna go look at a building. We're gonna go look at a site." And he would take my father out, and they would look around, and Zeckendorf would say, "Well, what do you do with this site? What are the potentials of it? Where are the subways? Where are the bus lines? How far is it to the airport?" Things of that sort. And my father, began to understand that when you evaluate property and the potential for property, you have to understand the site. And this is why it's very important to understand, when you see the exhibition, you see all the work that he has done, the most important thing for him at the very beginning was understand the value of property and the value of site. And when you look at all of his projects, and I hope you look at that in the context of looking at the site first, because before that, you don't even begin to ponder a design solution. In fact, I would say that throughout his career, he often looked at a site before and in his own mind, privately, before he even discussed it with anybody in his office, he would evaluate whether it was even worth doing, whether there was an opportunity there. Now, he started to work in 1949. There was a Federal Housing Act which allowed, which was intended federal government program to encourage the construction of low-income housing. And so this was an opportunity. It was very difficult to do good housing. The budgets were very, very low. And my father was attracted to the idea of, is there a way to do that with new materials instead of what was commonly used, these red brick facades. So what he tried to do and what he achieved is creating a building where the facade is also the structure. So it simplified the construction methodology. At the same time, it was allowed him to pioneer reinforced concrete for the first time in the United States, to make it not just a material of structure, but a material of architecture. So this was a very, very important period of his life. The other thing that's very important for him during this time, which also informed his later career, was he was meeting with mayors and governors and community groups and people like that, with whom he had to become familiar, knew how to address, knew how to talk to a, let's say, community organization that might be in opposition to what Zeckendorf wanted to do. So this experience where he was able to become conversant, become charming in the presence of opposition, to be able to stand firm for his principles and for his objectives architecturally, I think was a very important period, which again served him very well when he was dealing with very complex projects and expensive projects, working for some of the, well, I'll show you later on, some of his clients. I was probably the most important moment in his career, what really launched his career, was his appointment as the architect for the John Kennedy Memorial Library in 1964. Some of you know, Kennedy was assassinated in November 1963. They conducted a search for an architect, and by the middle of 1964, they had about 8 or 10 of the most famous architects in the world: Mies van der Rohe, Louis Kahn, Philip Johnson, you know, people of that stature. And my father was then not very well known at all, and he was on the list. So I remember that he was having a visit from Mrs. Kennedy to his office, so he had it painted. He had beautiful flowers right at the reception desk, and the story is that for her was one of the first things that she saw and she remembered very well. But I think another reason why he was selected is it was very difficult to get this commission, but I think they asked the question of each of these architects, if it's not you, who would be your second choice? And that was a very kind of subtle, deft way for them to see who might be the person. And it turned out that my father's name came up almost by all of the other architects. So that was one of the deciding factors. I remember when he received the notification of his selection. We were in Italy. I think that was that 1964 trip that you saw that picture of me. We were in. He had to receive a telephone call in the post office nearby in the town where we were spending the summer. And at a point an hour, and he went to receive that call. It was a very exciting moment. This photograph is 1964 when it was announced.
Well, thank you, Sandy, for sharing these highlights. I think you're particularly wanting to share also about the kind of culture of his studio that Pei set up. So I think these are some of the photos that you shared with us.
Yeah, this is, you know, the office was a beehive of activity, and one of the benefits of his work with Zeckendorf was by the time he left Zeckendorf, he had an office of about 120 people, all of all kinds of levels of expertise. He had people, not only architects, but we had people who were doing industrial design, graphic design, interior design, curtain walls, metals, stone, all of these experts. And there was probably no other firm in America that could harness that kind of skill set. And is one of the reasons why the place was such an exciting environment. My father typically would work during the day in his office and come out around 7 or 7:30 when everybody was completely exhausted and wanted to go home. And he would start designing at that point in time. This is some of the photographs here on the left-hand side, photograph of him probably. And he would do this every day coming out in the studio. You can see in some of these photographs where everybody's in shorts or in t-shirts because on weekends we had no air conditioning, things like that. We're always working there all day long, all night long, but it was that kind, the projects were so exciting and it was a wonderful place to be. People have always asked, well, what kind of, how did he generate designs? Does he come to the table with the design in hand? Aslihan and Calvin have both sort of described the process, but it bears repeating that he didn't really come to a table after, with a design to present to anybody. First of all, he very carefully selected who he wanted to work with. Of course, he had to look who was available, and then he would pick people. He actually, for example, on the Bank of China, I was fortunately finishing up a project. I was be able to work on the Bank of China. Calvin, of course, working on Fragrant Hill and Aslihan. Nothing needs further to be said. But what he would do is he would come to, he would have, by the time he put together one or two people, he would have already assessed the property a little bit in his own mind. He had looked at the site, as I said earlier. He had determined there was an opportunity to do something that he could do. And he had satisfied himself that he could work with all the existing problems and that there was a solution at hand. He didn't know what it would be. And what you can see in some of these scribbles here is an example of sort of what he might come to the table with. In fact, this might have been done at the table. And that would be what is left at the end of a conversation. We would have discussions about issues about the property and about what the program and height and budget and things of that sort. But he would leave that, and everybody, maybe 3 or 4 of us, would all go rush to the copier machine, make a copy, and go to our desk. And the next day, we'd all come back. I think Aslihan was talking about something like this. Everybody would come and put on the wall or on the table their scheme, and he would just look at them, and he would just look and look and look, and then maybe he would say he'll take out a piece of paper or draw on top of one of those sketches, and he'll just do something else. And by that, it was a sort of an iterative process by which a solution was coming through. In each time, he was searching through what other people were doing for something that could move forward a design, which he, in his mind, he had sort of imagined, but he didn't know how it would emerge. And so this is the kind of iterative process, but also the collaborative process, which described the nature of the firm, which was very, very stimulating. So the people really enjoyed the process, and by the time a design sort of came out, we all had sort of ownership of the design. The process meant that we would work on the project all the way through to completion, and this is very, very key to that whole this whole process of design in the firm. This is an example because I was working on the Bank of China with Calvin, but I started on this very beginning, and I can say that my father and I started the project beginning. And as you can see on the left-hand side, there's just this is a schedule that's not necessarily the beginning of it, but what the red lines already indicate is the importance of the site itself. And I don't know how many people here in Hong Kong know that the site that we were given did not resemble the site that we ended up developing. There was a parkland on the west side of the site that that we needed to negotiate in order to reconcile, in order to organize the site such that the building, the tower itself, could be on this grid of Central. And that was the first problem that we had to address. And the second problem was because of all the flyovers, there was no access, vehicular access to the site. So these are the kind of things which happen even before the design of a building emerges. We had to solve that problem. He had already, in his mind, determined that these things had to be, we had to succeed with the lands department, get their consent, get their help with mapping the site before we could begin to design. But the building itself, as you can see, I mean, emerges from those initial resolutions. And these are photographs that I took of my father when we first we took the square, 52 meters square, which was an appropriate size for a building of that size and area. And then we divided diagonally. At that point, when I made the model that you can see my father holding, at that point, a white model, we brought it to a structural engineer who my father, we work with a lot. His name is Leslie Robertson. And Les looked at it and just stared at it for a minute or 90 seconds, something like that, and just intuited at that point that this project could be not only engineered, but could be done extremely efficiently. And we were working with a very tight budget, 1 billion Hong Kong dollars at the time, which was 1/7 of what the Shanghai Bank cost. So, and yet, our building was over 300 meters tall and 1.3 million square feet. So at every step of the way, economy was the key. And so the efficiency of the building, particularly structurally, where the architecture and the structure become one in the design of this building, was key to the success, both architecturally, but also economically. And so this is the result of the design.
Thank you, Sandy. We're going to be kind of sharing some of the, I guess, more
yes.
reflection on your part about your father's work as a whole. And you put these images together.
Well,
all his work.
I think this only just illustrates that there were multiple different kinds of projects, but each of which emerged from an analysis or an examination of the constraints and the demands of the project. They're all so different because the conditions, the circumstances are different, and so there's a way to. They all share a sort of a knowledge and an interest and a preoccupation with geometry. And yet they use geometry here as a language to convey something of greater meaning, and because people can understand geometry, as Aslan said, and as these buildings have illustrated. Geometry is something which is not a style. It's a language by which we can explain what to others who can understand it. These are some clients. You probably can't see the names of them, but I'll just read you some of them. Lawrence Rockefeller, Michael Ovitz, Robert Kennedy, Jacqueline Kennedy, the Sheikh of Qatar, Helmut Kohl.
You want to share why the
François
statement,
Mitterrand.
choose your client, not the project, means?
Well, yes. He always said to us, you don't choose your project, you choose your client. Your client is with you all the way, and you have to find somebody who understands you, who shares your vision, and is going to work with you collaboratively to see it to fulfillment. And he always said that his best projects, the ones he's most fond of, are those where he had really good clients. So I think he had some very good clients.
So these are just some statements you also shared about his conviction or his quotes.
Well, this illustrates how important it is that he never really saw his buildings as sort of isolated. He always saw them in the context of other things, and he always felt that it was important to see buildings as existing in a larger community, and to therefore contribute to the development of a larger. He saw cities as living organisms into which we contribute, and make it, and heal it and make it grow. So urban planning and not seeing buildings as isolated objects was very important. The other thing is he always felt that it was very important to understand the site. He always said time, space, purpose. He always used those three words to describe the importance of understanding the essence of place, understanding the culture, the history of place before you begin to design. That was extremely important to him.
Well, it addresses the idea of what essence here mean as well, not purely that Orientalist essence, but something else. So yes. And then the last one was what you said about geometry, right? Yeah.
Geometry
Yeah.
For him was a language. It was a language, but it's not a style. And so he would say he didn't have a style, and all the buildings I think illustrate that.
Thank you. And then this is your favorite photo.
Yeah, is that great? Taken for his 100th birthday
Yeah.
in 1997.
So it's all very personal insight. Thank you so much, all three of you. And of course, we only have maybe about, 10 minutes? 8 minutes? 10 minutes left. Okay. But thank you, Calvin. Thank you, Asdahan. Thank you, Sandy. Yeah. So I threw one question to all three of you just now, which is the question about either one thing that you learned from working with Pei and your father, I guess, that shaped you in your process, in your kind of as a practitioner in architecture. But the other one could also be the question of relevance. I think one of the things that we have heard from some generation of architects or people today is like Pei was a dusty architect, right? It's a very different kind of a positioning. It's a very different way in which we choose to celebrate him, not on just a kind of an idea of like an ism or a style, but really the impact that his projects had made to cities. So I just wanted to also hear from you, who knows him so well, to address these two questions, which seems easy, but I think Asdahan said it's quite difficult. How it shapes you personally, but also perhaps what aspect of Pei's practice that you think is relevant for practice today.
Thank you for the difficult question. It is very difficult because I worked for IMPay for around 9 years on 2 different projects. Personally speaking, I had just moved to a completely different continent, and I was working in a completely different work environment. If I were to personally talk about the part that he influenced my practice or myself as an architect, is perseverance and being very serious and responsible. Because I learned not to say I am tired from him. He would never be tired. He would always be ready and anxious and curious as a child for every single detail, every single subject. And I think today it is very important to remember, and I think it also relates to the title of the exhibition very much, to not do architecture as a profession through which you earn your living, but to actually live as an architect and to look into your environment through that kind of lens where you are a responsible professional that can shape the world for the people to enjoy it. So I think I would say that perseverance and being very serious about it.
How about the kind of like, how would this matter to practice today? Something less personal, but of course you're free to also end there.
I have a very, very different practice than the one that I was part of while working with Mr. Pei. Very different practice in terms of scale, in terms of my clients, maybe. And I actually, there's one thing like this whole idea of geometry that actually or this idea of understanding the essence of this architecture, which always becomes a very problematic concept when a lot of people are hearing this concept. What is the essence of Islamic architecture? What's the essence of this place? But it is actually there are shared values and principles that can cut cross throughout all of different cultures. Because if you're building in Doha, you're building in Miho, you're building in New York, there are very universal values of human dignity, of space that is enjoyed together as a community, of traditions that, or let's not call it traditions, but the continuity of time and continuity of the craft, of certain ways of making that actually that connects this time, and those are very, very, very universal values. So even though you do a very different practice with different clients, with different scales and with different geographies, there is something very, very universal that actually somehow I feel I have inherited from him. And I think Mr. Pei, being from a very, very different planet than where we find ourselves right now, because throughout, I think, his education and also my education, we actually did not address the fact that we were living in a damaged planet, and that the planet we're living in right now has doesn't have infinite sources. So we are faced with a whole different world right now. And I think he comes from a different world where we all thought this planet was infinite. It had infinite resources, but this what I just try to outline, that architecture is responsible about your resources and is responsible about providing and facilitating space for human dignity and community. It is very universal in the way that is actually very relevant for today, our practice and our world.
Yeah, thanks.
Well, I mean, first of all, those end quotes that Sandy shared kind of speaks for itself. The things that we've learned are those messages. So I won't go into personally. I would say, well, first of all, you know, the amount of people that came out of that office who have gone on to do very meaningful work is an indication that he knows that the architecture is not only just about teamwork, that you have to play it forward, that it is about a legacy that's continued, and we're just one moment, and that we are responsible to bring the past to the present, and then make sure that we also contribute to the future. And I think the way he feels accountable by nurturing us, knowing where all of us, what we're capable of, where to push us, and where to stretch us, where to encourage us, and to remind us of our responsibility. He always say, you know, there's a what, and there's a how, and there's a where, but most importantly, it's why. He always asks, why are we doing this? And in that sense, I think even in today's world, he will do the right thing in the issue of contemporary challenges. He will embrace climate change. He will embrace social discontent and find its way to make our built environment that he supports relevant to his time and beyond.
Thanks, Calvin. Sandy, you have the last.
The only thing I would observe is that although you'll see that his career produced so many, his legacy of his life was the production of some incredible monuments that our world, everyone knows and admires. And yet, one of the things that I always think about is how modest and self-effacing was the man who produced them. Because I think that he always put, in a sense, his own ego behind, and what he's tried to do in all of these projects is to really find the source of the design in where the building was located. He was very interested in history. He was very interested in culture and continuity. He always wanted to find the right solution for place. And once he understood that, then he can apply a design. Anybody could apply the design to a site, but not everybody can understand the site without analyzing it very intensely. And I think one of the things I admired most about the way he worked is that he really conducted a lot of research in his own mind, examination, before he even accepted a commission. And so I look at the work, even though there's a signature quality, everybody says, the geometry is as I said, is the language through which these buildings are realized. However, they have a kind of a modesty about them because they come from within. The design comes from within.
Thank you. So this is should we open up to questions or not? Due to time, I'll let Carrie decide. Thank you both. Thank you all so much.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much for being here today. This was such a fantastic opportunity to hear more about IMPE, and each of your perspectives has truly enriched my understanding, and I've been working on this show with Shirley for a number of months, so it's such a great pleasure. And so I really think you need to take some of that curiosity and interest and bring it into the exhibition, and please do visit it yourselves. It's open from today until January, so you have a bit of time to come back more than once even. And there will be more public programs supporting the IMPE exhibition, and we'll definitely be inviting you to join us on those occasions as well. So without further ado, I'd like to thank the panel for your time, for being here, and I'm going to ask you to step forward and have a nice group photo, and then I'm going to escort you off the stage.